Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to be here with you all today, coming from Oakland, California, where my West Coast people out, the home of the Black Panthers, which is a movement that has inspired my activism. And so I'm here to talk about culture as power, right? And especially narrative power, cultural justice. So first is that, I think a lot of us, as we were growing up, we were taught that there is different kinds of power, right? There's people power, there's economic power, earth power, and there's also cultural power. And that is the ability to leverage the power of our creativity, of our imaginations, to create change in the world. And so often, as artists, as creators, our work has been seen as a nicety and not a necessity. But in reality, every single social movement was not that movement without the arts central to that movement. And so at my organization, the Center for Cultural Power, we believe in the power of stories, because stories change people and people change systems. And stories speak to us because as human beings, we are wired for stories. Stories speak to our emotions. And neuroscience demonstrates to us that human beings will react more to their emotions than they will to rational knowledge. And so, when we talk about what needs to shift is our worldview. Because issues actually divide people, but values unite. And today, we are living in a worldview that's over 500 years, a colonial worldview that said that certain bodies, certain human bodies, certain animal bodies, earth bodies, forest bodies, ocean bodies can be exploited for the benefit of a privileged few. And we live in a worldview that allowed for the exploitation of certain bodies to consolidate wealth and power, right? And so when we think about stories, the original story is that stolen land, stolen bodies, stolen culture. And so we have to remember that, because a lot of what's happening, a lot of what we're experiencing today, in reality, is about a core narrative. It's a core story that has shaped our societies for hundreds and hundreds of years, and it comes down to the exploitation and extraction of life from bodies, from our forests, from our oceans. It is why today we are in a climate crisis, because of colonization, right? And so as storytellers, we have to understand that this is not about just gender justice, racial justice, climate justice. This is worldview shift, our ability to see the world through a different lens, right? To experience our relationship to each other as human beings through a different lens that's not from extraction, that's actually about regeneration. That's not domination, that's partnership. That is what it's going to require for us to emerge from this colonial worldview, which is killing us. We are experiencing today, the climate crisis, y'all, is very real. The climate crisis is the result of racial capitalism. And so when we tell our stories, it's about imagining a possible future, not just reacting to the narratives, to the dominant narratives, and saying no to this, no to that, but also what are we saying yes to? What is the pathway that we are charting for people to imagine a different future than we have today? And we've been doing this work so powerfully, right? In music, in sports, in film, in television, in creativity through music. Art is what sparks. It is what shows us the light at the end of the tunnel, and it is what makes the impossible feel tangible. That's a very, very, very powerful tool. It's called the tool of the story. Next slide. So, for many, many years, our social justice infrastructure, as we have known it, has focused on this, on political change, right? It's why you have a 501c3 infrastructure, which y'all, the 501c3 structure, does anyone know when it was born? It was born in 1969. So we are in a very early stage of having an infrastructure that supports movements, that supports creativity, the 501c3, the nonprofit structure. There has been so much resources poured into this, right? Into communication strategy, boots on the ground, legislation, policy wins. And we also know that there's another very powerful realm in this country, in this world, and it's the economic realm, right? The power of corporations to shape everything from the air we breathe to the water we drink to how much we get paid. So when we think about how social change happens, a lot of times we think about, oh, it happens here. In reality, social change happens in these three realms, but culture is the most powerful realm because culture shapes the economic sector and it shapes the political sector. And in reality, a policy is a manifestation of an idea whose time has come. But we create the ideas in the realm of culture. And so, in our movements for achieving justice, we have actually invested very little in our cultural infrastructure. And if you look at our opposition, they have invested a lot in their cultural infrastructure, in their television, their podcast, their film. They go big on their creators. And so we cannot win without cultural infrastructure because culture moves faster than politics. Culture precedes politics, right? And we can't win without culture. And so when you wonder, well, why is it that, as creatives, we have such little resources? It's because there has been a lack of investment in the cultural sector. Because for too long, culture has been seen as something soft, and politics has been seen as something hard. But I'm going to walk you through some examples so that you understand how exactly culture has not only shaped policy, it has accelerated cultural change. And imagine what's possible when we organize ourselves as cultural workers, right? When we are able to unite under some key wins and understand our power as change makers. Because I think the other thing that the colonial worldview has taught us is that as artists, we're just creators. We don't have the power to change the world. But we actually do, because what speaks to people's heart is culture. And in culture, we change worldview. In the world of politics, we change systems of governance. The world of economics determines how resources are allocated. And culture can shape both of these. So speaking of worldview, how not only do we understand that culture is powerful, but the people who have their levers on the hands of culture are determining our behaviors and our values, right? And I think, I remember when I was a kid and I would go to museums and I would ask myself, why are all these artists white? Why is there a cultural system that prioritizes certain voices over others? Today, we are experiencing the world through the lens of white, able-bodied, cis men. We are literally seeing the world through their eyes. And when you look at film production, you all know this, but you understand who's financing, who's in the board of directors of these major film companies, right? It's the same thing for publishing. It's the same thing for music, performance, dance, cooking. Every single cultural sector in this country is run by white men. And so as a result, we are experiencing the world through their lens. And the power that we can do is we can show people how to experience the world from another perspective. And imagine what could happen when we experience the world through the lens of a Black trans woman, or somebody who's disabled, or an undocumented immigrant. That is what creates empathy, and empathy then leads to mobilization. And so not only is it about telling our stories, it's about building cultural infrastructure, and that means building the platforms, the relationships, the pathways for long-term cultural power. Because as you all know, you all seen this, we're seeing this in entertainment, we're seeing this in film and TV, is that the white-led institutions cannot be trusted to implement diversity initiatives. You're seeing the largest exodus of DEI positions because the power has to be by the most impacted. The people who are impacted have to be leading on building institutions, and it also means that we organize ourselves to build power for the long term, for wealth generation, for power generation. Next slide. So I'm going to walk you through now some examples of how major wins happened because of culture. right? And I want to walk you through this because today there is something called narrative strategy. There is a booming narrative strategy infrastructure. And I'm sure you all have worked with funders and organizations who talk about narrative strategy. Well, what is narrative strategy? We're going to get into it because the narrative strategy train is moving, and it's important that all of you as filmmakers not just see yourselves as filmmakers, but you see yourselves as narrative strategists, as cultural strategists, because this is going to be the field that is growing. Our opposition is growing this space tremendously. I don't know how many of you saw the debate around the GOP candidates. It is culture. We are in a time of culture wars, y'all. The things that are being talked about are about culture. The attacks on CRT is about rewriting the core story of how this country was founded. That is a question of culture. That is how people learn about culture. I'm going to talk a little bit about the backlash on trans people. That is a reaction to culture change. So, marriage equity. Ellen DeGeneres comes out on national TV in 1997. What happened in 1996? The Defense of Marriage Act was signed by Clinton. But even before that, what was happening in the 80s? In the 80s, there was a word that folks were using, homosexual, right? We didn't say queer, we didn't say gay, we didn't say LGBT. Homosexual was the word the AP used. GLAAD told the AP, don't use that word, use the word gay, and began to work with the entertainment industry to support the inclusion of LGBTQ characters. And you have Ellen come out in 97. How many of you watched that show? Okay, so what did Ellen do with her girlfriend? It wasn't even her girlfriend, it was her love interest, right? She went like this. That's it, that's all we saw. And it created a huge conversation. You know, at that time in this country, very few Americans supported what was called same-sex marriage. What happened after Ellen? Next slide. You had Will and Grace, Queer Eye, of course, a very white-dominant stories. And then you had the L word, right? And I want you to think about how we went from a peck to full-on sexy scenes. That is culture change. That is the normalization and visibility of stories, and it starts with one story. It starts with one story that creates more stories. You had the Laramie Project, the story of Matthew Shepard, become the most popular play in high schools, right? You have the first, I know, white rapper Macklemore, but it was the first time that you had a pop song showing a queer relationship. And y'all, we didn't get until 2013, 10 years ago, the first athlete comes out on the cover of Sports Illustrated. It has not been that long. And meanwhile, what did we have? We had Don't Ask, Don't Tell being gone. By 2013, there was a win at the Supreme Court. Again, by 2013, when you polled Americans, by then you had passed the 56% mark, right? Which meant that the majority of Americans now supported gay marriage. And then you had it codified. So culture change precedes political change, and policies are the last manifestation of an idea whose time has come. We generate those ideas. 2013, something else happened. The first black trans actress on a major television show, Orange is the New Black. What followed? Janet Mock, Pose, right? The visibility of trans characters, the popularity of the use of pronouns. The New York Times last year did a report that said that for the first time in history, you have a record-breaking amount of teenagers identifying as non-binary. Culture change through pop culture, the written word, poetry, visibility, new practices. You know why we're having a backlash now? Because culture is changing. And the folks who want to hold on to an old cultural view will always fight us back. This is why today we're even discussing sustaining gay marriage, right? And so when you hear people say, oh, you're singing to the choir, we have to continue singing. Once we achieve narrative power, it's about sustaining narrative power. The choir has to sing from the same playbook in order for us to sustain, because it's not just about reaching a win, it's about sustaining a win. Next slide. So, Me Too. Y'all know that sexual harassment has been a problem since we were born, okay? Tarana Burke had created a hashtag, Me Too, But that hashtag was not popularized until Alyssa Milano tweeted it out in January 2018. Time's Up was born in the most powerful industry of narrative that shapes hearts and minds around the planet. We saw the reality of what's happening around sexual abuse and sexual harassment. And you know, it started with one story. It started with Rose McGowan's story, which you all know was a heavily blocked story, right? Rose McGowan, same thing happened with the gymnast doctor at MSU. It started with one story, Rachel DeHollander. It led to 250 stories. Okay, the power of the story is that it opens the door to more stories. When we have something called a floating signifier, which was Me Too, this also happened with Occupy. You know what Occupy gave us? The language of the 1%. The ability to talk about wealth inequality in a simple signifier. And that's also the power of culture. Me Too generated an entire moment. And what it did, it shifted culture in the sense that we believed people. We believed them, right? Imagine October 2018, 10 months later, Dr. Christine Blasey Ford has a moment in Congress. This is culture influencing politics. She would not have had a hearing were it not for the culture change moment. And so this is what's possible when we talk about the power of the story and what it means to elevate the story, right? To normalize the story and to shift and to begin to hold systems accountable. If you remember that graph, culture, politics, economics, I know in your places of work, you all have probably have to redo all your sexual harassment training. There has been revisions. It has shaped the economic sector, and it has definitely shaped the political sector, right? It's how Carl Tuckerson got off the air. Sorry, I get my names mixed up. Tucker Carlson. That's how we got off the air, right? It's because of Me Too. And so how we understand that culture, the times of how culture is changing politics is getting smaller and smaller, right? Because you saw gay marriage took over 15 years. Trans visibility has taken 10 years. And this, from 2018 to now, 5 years. Next slide. So I love this example because this is our dear friend, Dream Hampton, Detroit. By the way, shout out to Dream for being a critical voice in the 50th anniversary of hip hop. That's what we need. When you talk about the power of storytelling, the courage it takes to break dominant frames, that's Dreamy. So Dream Hampton, Surviving R. Kelly, right? The documentary film that created a level of accountability at a time when the conversation was being had. And that is a very, very powerful intervention, which cost her a lot. But what ended up happening is we saw justice, right? Because R. Kelly has been a known thing for decades. And it took Dream Hampton to tell this story. And shout outs to Dream also for now creating climate narratives. She just finished a film about flooding, and really her ability to center the most impacted, right? And this is the power of documentary film, which this actually was one of the most watched series on Lifetime television, right? Dream Hampton, who was first a journalist and then got into film. Next slide. Of course, my dear friend from Oakland, Kamau Bell, who, you know, I remember when Kamau was a comedian, and I would go hear his shows. I was like one of the only people laughing, right? So Kamau, I met Kamau in 2011 when he was just a comedian. And I want to offer you all this, y'all, is that at this point, our mediums is being limited by our medium is a thing of the past. There is something called transmedia now. He is a great example of transmedia. The ability to tell your story through all media, podcasts, a news show, his comedy shows, and now documentary film, right? The ability to create institutions, the institution that he is building for emerging storytellers. So Kamau Bell with comes out with we got to talk about Cosby, right? Another key intervention point done through his lens that created accountability in a moment of Me Too. And I don't know if you all seen his most recent documentary about mixed race kids on Showtime. But another, powerful intervention inspired by his own life story. So the ability to work at large scale and very small scale, right? Because through his show, United States of America, the coverage that he's been able to do on trans visibility, on attacks on Muslims, right, on the South, incredible and inspiring to all of us of what he's been able to achieve in 1 decade. Next slide. So narrative strategy, what it is, it's the ability for us to leverage the art and the science of messages, of stories, of deep narratives in order to create justice and free us all, right? So it's not just about folks, working in their studios. It's about our ability to change systems, right, through the telling of a story. Because all of us possess the ability to tell a story in a very different way than our friends at the grassroots, at the front lines. And that is the power that we bring. Next slide. And at my organization, the Center for Cultural Power, we do narrative strategy with BIPOC creators, right? We know that BIPOC creators bring a lens and an experience of authenticity that will move hearts and minds even faster than what dominant culture can create, right? So both the recognition of whose voices to support, while also understanding that we need to build collective power. And we can build collective power. My story is that I grew up in Oakland, California during the era of the war on drugs. And school for me was my education. My parents, who were both immigrants, didn't finish high school. They were like, you got to be a doctor. You got to be a lawyer. We're going to put you're going to be in all the honors classes. You're going to be in the math and science program on the weekends. And I always knew I wanted to be an artist. And I remember when I met Emory Douglas from the Black Panthers and Kathleen Cleaver, and they told me about Nina Simone. I met Sonia Sanchez, Amiri Baraka, right, who told me about the Black arts movement. And what I always wondered is I was like, why are my mentor artists struggling so much, right? Folks like the muralists, the folks from the Chicano art movement, folks like the Panthers even, didn't have money to pay their medical bills, right? Nina Simone died without health insurance. So did Zora Neale Hurston. The difference that we need to do, our generation, is that we need to build infrastructure and wealth, because thank you. Our predecessors did not build that for us, and so we have needed to create it, and they couldn't build it because COINTELPRO was coming after them. And also because a lot of our ancestors, the shoulders we stand on, they wanted a seat at the table. But we are now building a new table, right? We're building our own institutions, and so we have to understand what it means for us to demand resources. These are resources that were extracted from our community, right? Crystal Echohawk of Illuminative talks about the extraction of culture, the stolen culture that has actually built the backbone of this country is what belongs to us. And so I wanna, as you all think about your projects, this is why we have to get organized, is because we need to do a transfer of cultural power back to us for future generations, right? So that the artists that come after us have institutions and platforms and training programs and networks to be able to succeed at an even more powerful level than our generation will do. Next slide. So to close it out, I want to talk to you about what we mean by deep narratives next, because you'll hear me talk about this, and I gotta go a little faster because there's just a few more things I want to show you. So, next slide. You should be able to see the deep narratives. This is the deep narratives that sustain our current culture, right? Individualism, white supremacy, it's a dangerous world. You need to work, and that defines your human value. Anti-blackness, anti-indigeneity, scarcity, y'all. Austerity is a worldwide problem. There is enough wealth in this world, but there is a sham. These are the narrative pillars that hold up our current dominant culture. Next slide. Instead, imagine what it would be like if we have our own narrative pillars of interconnectedness, love, biodiversity, y'all. I'm gonna tell you something about biodiversity as a climate activist. You know that our planet is dying because of monoculture, because of agriculture, because of deforestation for cattle ranching, right? Because of fossil fuels. Monoculture kills. White supremacy is monoculture. It's when you see the same thing over and over and over. Monoculture kills, biodiversity, leads to healthy ecosystems. This is why we need our forests, right? This is why people are fighting for the forest. They are fighting for biodiversity. But there is also biodiversity of the mind, and there is biodiversity of us as human beings. And I want you to remember that the earth teaches us everything we need to know. Nature is our teacher. And nature teaches us that biodiverse systems are the strongest, which means that the more diversity we have in our systems, in our storytelling, will make for strength and power. Next slide. The last example I want to show you is from what it means to go hyper-local, right? Because I showed you big, national, powerful examples on national television. But there's also power in going local. So my organization last year, next slide, supported 6 filmmakers in creating 30 films targeted around getting folks to vote in the key swing states, right? And so we worked with 6 filmmaking teams to experiment on how to move people. And we learned a lot. We learned things like, the combination of animation and film moves audiences in a very unique way. Using comedy to talk about climate change. So we found that in working with certain production houses that we were able to shift people's mobilization rates, right? In other words, that this was not a regular, go out and vote PSA. This was about telling very unique stories from the region. And that those kinds of stories were moving people in a whole point system, increasing their desire to vote. Next slide. So some things that emerged is that when you create content that's specific to a demographic, that you are able to move that demographic faster than content that speaks to a very wide audience. So for example, right, Eva Longoria, she's my friend, I love Eva, can make a really cool PSA that says, hey, mi gente, go out and vote. And she might have millions of followers, and she might get millions of likes. And when you work with a very micro-influencer, right, somebody who has maybe 150,000, and they are able to speak and say something authentic, the engagement levels goes up, which tells us what? People trust the messenger. And so when it comes to moving hearts and minds around key issues, it is actually better to go hyper-local and tell stories from that audience. And that diverse characters mobilize diverse audiences, and that some of the typical election ads, that actually the more creative and artistic you get. So we had poets, we had musicians, we had a combination of dancers, that the more creative you got, the more you moved people. These are some of the early learnings that were emerging. Y'all know 2024 is a huge election year, but I encourage you to think about how to leverage the power of film for activating and mobilizing folks. Next slide. So in closing, I want to say that this has been said earlier before, is that we are in a moment that needs deep reimagining and systemic solutions. Never before in our human history have we had the intersection of economic crisis, pandemic, racial reckoning, and climate crisis. Okay? The pulling back of the curtains on everything from our healthcare systems to how people retire, to how people get educated, to what they're reading in schools is all being called into question. And as Naomi Klein says, when there's chaos, you got to come with a plan. You got to come with a vision of what to offer people. Because if you don't, that gap is going to be filled in by our opposition, right? And so in this moment of reimagining what's possible as storytellers, how do we inspire people to imagine a different kind of future, to imagine their yes, to see and experience what the yes is? And for that, we need to be organized with our deep narratives. We have to understand that it's not just about fighting. You know, I love that I was raised in Oakland with the Panthers, and we can't just always fight. People don't want to join the struggle. People want to be liberated. They want to feel joy. They want to feel freedom. And so how do we translate the values that we want to move people towards? Our yes, interconnectedness, care, love, biodiversity, the ability, ancestral wisdom, right? Let's tap into that, and let's imagine what's possible with our collective power. Thank you very much.
Give it up.